Hi, it's Professor Shoemaker, and what I'm going to do here is give you a demo of cell references. A cell reference is any time in Excel a function or an formula in one cell refers to another cell. So for example, if I come in here in cell F3 and I say equals C2, that's a reference to C2, and when I hit enter here, then it will just bring the value down here as well. So this expression here, equals C2, is just a reference from one cell into another. References are used all over the place in Excel, and it's important to understand them in detail. This is going to be an important part of the class. By the way, in the demo that I'm doing here, the spreadsheet that I have posted on Blackboard also has the finished version here. So if you select this worksheet, you'll be able to see the finished version. So let's walk through the problem. What we've got here is a spreadsheet whose job it is to calculate the cost of keeping containers in a warehouse. So many containers for so many days, and what it cost. The bean counters and accounting decided that it cost $1.50 per day per container to keep a container on board. That includes all the overhead costs like insurance and real estate taxes and payroll and keeping the lights on and those kinds of expenses. It worked out, the bean counter said, to $1.50 a day. So what this problem is about is if we have 100 containers for 10 days, how much is that going to cost? Or 200 containers for 30 days, how much will that cost? So what we're going to do in this little section right here in this table is calculate the cost to keep so many containers for so many days for every combination of containers and days used in this where there's only 9 options here. So in Excel there's 3 kinds of references from one cell to another. Relative, which is the default. If you don't do anything and get a relative reference. Absolute, and mixed, which is a combination of relative and absolute. Which kind of reference you use, relative, absolute, or mixed, depends upon how you are going to planning on copying a formula from one cell to another. So for example, if I come back here in this cell and say equals C2, like that, that's what's called a relative reference. That means that Excel doesn't think of this as pointing at cell C2. It thinks of it as left 1, 2, 3, 4, and then up 1. So that's a relative reference. Left 1, 2, 3, 4, up 1. Like that. I'm just going to, for an example, type a different number down here. Now, watch what happens when I copy this cell down to the next cell. The reference is C2, but when I copy it down, in this cell, it's going to become a reference to C3. That's because for this cell here, G4, this cell over here is left 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 1. So Excel doesn't think of a relative reference as pointing at C2 or pointing at C3. It thinks of it as left 4, up 1. So when you have a relative reference and you copy it to a different cell, it keeps the same relative address, left 4, up 1. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. Let's walk through the problem here. I'm going to delete these values and get back to the basic spreadsheet. So what I want to do is say the cost of a container is the cost for 1 day times the number of containers times the number of days. And when I do that, I get an expression C2 times B7 times C7, which is correct. And so to keep 100 containers for 10 days, it's at $1.50 a piece. It's going to cost $1,500. That's what the warehouse carrying cost is for keeping inventory on hand. Now, that works fine, but I begin to run into problems when I start dragging the expression out to the right, for example. Now I want to copy it over into this cell. So I grab it and I copy it. And now I get a number that is 0. It's showing up as blank here because this is formatted as dollars, but it's showing up as 0. And the reason is, and one thing that helps a lot in Excel is you can click up here in the formula bar at the top and that will highlight the cells that are being referred to. So look at what happened to the reference to C2. It turned into D2 here because as far as Excel is concerned, this C2 really means up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when we copy the expression from here to here, it still points to up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now things are not working right in the expression. Empty cells like this are treated as a 0, which is why when you plug a 0 into this formula, you wind up with a 0 as the result. In addition, this reference here to B7 got changed to C7. So now it's pointing at this cell instead of the 100. That's because it doesn't think of B7 as B7. It thinks of it as left 1. The one value that did work out right was the C6, which points up to the cell 1 above it. Over here, that got changed to D6, which is still one cell up. So it almost worked, but not quite. What we want, I'm going to delete this formula. What we want when we use this formula and want to drag it right where it is, we want it to still point at C2. And we still want to point it at B7. So what we're going to do is come in here and change this to the reference to C2 to be an absolute expression. Now, the way I do that is to press the F4 key. And when I do, it'll put dollar signs in front of the C and a dollar sign in front of the 2. The dollar sign means the C is frozen, and the dollar sign in front of the 2 means the 2 is frozen. So when I take this expression now and I copy it to the right, instead of pointing at D2, it now stays pointed at C2, because this is what's called an absolute reference. No matter where I copy the expression on the spreadsheet, it will always point at C2. C7 didn't quite work right. With C7, I want it to go rightward, and I want it to, C7. I want it to point back at B7. So, because it's pointing at this 1500 instead of the 100 here, because of that, we wound up with a really huge number, $45,000, which is way too big. So I'm going to delete this expression and come back here. And now I'm going to change B7. Now, I want it to point at the B column. And I want it to point at the 7 row. But as I drag it rightward, I don't care about the row. I care about the B. So what I'm going to do is press F4 once, and then I'm going to press F4 a second time, and then finally a third time. And that will leave me with a dollar sign in front of the B, but not in front of the 7. That means I'm going to freeze the B column, but not the 7 row. Now, this is a combination of an absolute reference to B and a relative reference to 7. That kind of expression is called a mixed reference. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that, and now I'm going to slide it to the right. And look, it worked right because it stayed on the B7. The D6 points up to the 20, that's correct, and the C2 still points at C2. I'm going to drag the expression one more cell to the right, and we now have a first row that's working right. $1,500, $3,000, $4,500. Now let's take this expression and drag it down a cell, and we begin to get into trouble. Now we have $450,000. That's an enormous number. That's because we have multiplied by the value, I'm pointing in the wrong cell. We have multiplied by the value 1,500. When we dragged it down, instead of pointing at 10 days, it's now pointing at 1,500, and we wind up with a really large number. So we want this expression, when we drag it down, to continue to point to row 6. So what we need to do is come into this cell and freeze the 6 in C6. So I'm going to highlight that, press F4 once, press F4 again. Now I've frozen the 6. By the way, if I keep pressing F4, it will take me through all 4 possibilities. Relative reference, or absolute rather, mixed, mixed, and back to relative again. I want to freeze the 6, so I want the expression to be C $6. I hit enter. Now if I drag the expression down, it will work on all 3 rows down, and when I drag it rightward, it'll work across all the cells in the table. So here I have pointing at the top 10 and 100. Over here, this expression is pointing at 20 and 100. Down here in this cell, I'm pointing at 330 days. So that's what absolute and relative and mixed references do on a spreadsheet. By the way, remember that you can hold down the control key and press the tilde, and it will show you all the expressions. The tilde is the key above the tab and to the left of the 1 key. So I'm going to hold down control again and put it back to normal. Post questions or send me emails if you have questions about how this works. Post questions on the discussion board. Thanks.